Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum. I'm honored to be speaking to you, students at Aligarh Muslim University. It's an honor to have the opportunity to talk to you about the subject of haya in Islam. And my name is Daniel Haqiqatjou. I'm a writer, speaker, and professor in the United States, and I've been writing about topics related to Islam and modernity for over 5 years now. I studied physics and philosophy at Harvard University and completed graduate studies as well. And you can find my writing on muslimskeptic.com with a K, muslimskeptic.com. And even there, you'll find some articles and materials that have been translated into Hindi as well, so you can read them in that language. What I want to talk to you today about is a subject that is very important to the concept of haya, which is gender separation. And the thing about gender separation is that it has been neglected. It is increasingly neglected out around the world and globally. And this is something that I consider to be a sickness. I consider the erosion of gender segregation and separation to be a sickness. And it's a sickness that is spreading around the globe. It is spreading around the globe. And we need to be able to address this sickness. We need to address it and give the cure for it. And this is what Islam provides. And so what I want to do for you in this short period of time is explain exactly what is so problematic about gender mixing and the lack of gender separation and how that has evolved in the West historically, and then also explain how Islam addresses this. So I'm going to be focusing on three main areas when it comes to education, when it comes to work, the workplace environment, and finally, when it comes to marriage. So when it comes to education, first and foremost, when did co-education first begin? Okay, we tend to think that this is something that has existed throughout history, but that's not the case. Around the 1970s is when we see co-education first coming into being. And even Harvard University originally was separated. Men and women were separated into different campuses. And only in the 70s did both sexes come together into one campus. And this same pattern was repeated on campuses throughout the United States and the West more broadly. And the Princeton scholar and author Nancy Markeel, she has a book that goes into detail on these changes on university campuses. And she references university professors at Yale and at Princeton and at other universities that were competing for the top students, for the top male students. And what these university presidents figured out is that they would be able to attract the top talent and the top students around the country if they made their campuses co-ed, meaning with men and women mixed in classes and even in dormitories. And so this was what they saw as a money-making venture: attract the top students, attract the top talent around the country by offering this easier accessibility to females. Okay, so this is something that is explicitly documented, and the feminists at that time saw this for what it was and were opposed to co-education, and they saw this as a violation of women's rights. So this is kind of opposite to what we think today. We think that, oh, well, feminists and the women's movement would encourage the mixing of the genders and having one campus or one university for both genders mixed together, but actually historically that's not the case. And one of the most prominent feminists of the 20th century, Gloria Steinem, was opposed to co-education in the 70s and early 80s. And she said that this desegregation benefits men and is a disadvantage to women. Okay. And so this is what started the trend of co-education within the United States and the West more generally. It wasn't something for the benefit of women. It was purely a money-making prospect. And now we're seeing a reverse trend. In the past 20 years, we're seeing a reverse trend in education where there's more encouragement. There are voices advocating gender separation. Okay. The maintaining of modesty, the maintaining of men and women separate. Okay. And I'll give you a statistic. In 2002, in the United States, there were only about 11 schools that had boys and girls separate. Okay, only 11 in 2002. But by 2012, now at that point, there's 550 schools that have boys and girls separate. And you have prominent psychologists and psychiatrists saying that there are benefits to having this separation. And a prominent example that I can give you of one of these intellectuals is Dr. Leonard Sachs. Dr. Leonard Sachs. And he argues that mixing the genders in a school environment has negative cognitive effects and actually decreases the capacity for learning in both boys and girls. And so he's an advocate of gender separation when it comes to education. And there are many other authors and intellectuals who argue this, and there's even studies that have shown the impact on the male mind, on the female mind, when you are around individuals of the opposite sex, okay? Especially non-family members, okay? So it affects the mind. It affects the way you behave. It affects you on the hormonal level. It affects you on the neurophysiological level, okay? And simply being in the same, in the presence of, in the same room, in the same location as the opposite sex is shown to have these kinds of impact, this kind of impact to the human body, to the human mind. Of course, this will affect learning. Of course, this will affect behavior. Of course, this has all kinds of negative impact. And this is something that we now know through the use of scientific psychological methods. But this is something obvious. This is something that civilization has known, okay, for centuries. Civilization has known this for centuries, but we've forgotten. We've forgotten this wisdom, that there is great wisdom and benefit in separating the genders. Okay. So we need to go back to the wisdom of Islam. We need to go to the wisdom of our faith. Okay. And understand this concept of hayat and the practical implications that it has for our education. Okay. So I'm talking about education. Let's look at the workplace environment. So when it comes to the workplace, there's been a lot of controversy recently. And if you've been following the news, you've heard about the Me Too movement. Me Too, meaning there's been women who have come forward saying that they've been the victims of sexual harassment and assault and molestation within the workplace. And this is extremely disturbing. This is extremely troubling because you have men in power, okay, who are using and taking advantage of their position of power to prey upon women. So why is this happening? And what can be done to address it? Well, the solution that has been offered by people in the West, people devoted to secularism, people devoted to a liberal morality, perhaps even feminism, they argue that we need more education. We need to educate men not to mistreat women in this way. We need to have education. We need to have legal consequences. And this will solve the issue. But we should reflect on that. We should reflect, is this really the kind of solution that is needed? Is it a solution that could ever be effective? And the fact of the matter is that men and women co-mixing within the workplace environment is something that's only been happening for 60 years. About 60 years do we see this phenomenon. And prior to that, there wasn't this kind of mixing. You had women and men working separately, and there was separation of the genders prior to 60 years ago. But that changed, and co-mixing became more common in the workplace until the situation that we have today. But there's been plenty of legislation. There's been plenty of policies, workplace policies mandated by the government to prosecute or to discourage harassment and to penalize and punish those who prey on women and use their position of power to prey on women. Okay, so this is not something that has just come up. There's been 60 years of these kinds of policies that have been created, legislation that's been created to educate and control the behavior of men and prevent them from harassing and molesting within the workplace environment. So what makes us think that more of this, okay, what more can be done, first of all? What more education can be given? Okay, if you've worked in some of these jobs in corporate America, and I have, there's plenty of education that is required by law, that everyone receives to understand that sexual harassment will in no way, shape, or form be tolerated. But the problem is not the lack of education. The problem is not the lack of penalty and discouragement. Okay? So this, after 60 years, there's still no clear solution. There are no solutions that have been forthcoming. And so we have to ask bigger questions. We have to think that maybe there is a deeper issue here. There is a deeper problem here. Maybe, okay, and this is what, as Muslims, we should suggest, maybe it's not possible for men and women to mix in a workplace environment and that always be 100% safe. Okay? Maybe that is the reality and there's no denying it. There's no, after 60 years and policies and education and all this type of activism and control, we haven't seen changes in this kind of behavior from a certain percentage of men, a small percentage of men. So how do we prevent this harm, this harassment from taking place? Well, maybe the temptation needs to be removed entirely. Maybe that is the only solution. And when it comes to the suggestion that education can somehow solve this problem, we don't have that kind of approach when it comes to something like drugs. We don't have that kind of mentality that the government just simply needs to educate the population about the dangers of drug use. That's part of the solution. Another very large part of the solution is making sure that drugs are not introduced into the environment, to make sure that drugs are limited and that there isn't this influx of drug trafficking into the country. That's a major part of the overall complete solution. You have to limit people's ability to access the temptation if you want to prevent that kind of behavior. Why can't we have that similar mentality when it comes to sexual assault, sexual harassment, and all of these problems that we find in the workplace? So these are the kinds of questions that we as Muslims, based on our understanding of hayat, based on our understanding of the dangers of mixing, ikhtilat, these are the kinds of questions that we have to be asking and offering to the world at large. Okay, Islam has the solution. Islam has been a thriving civilization for over 1400 years. We can provide these answers to humanity. We just have to have the confidence in our own deen. We have to understand the wisdom of Islam, of Islamic law, of the Sharia, in order to be able to offer this to the world at large and be that guiding light of hidayah that will take humanity to that next level towards the path of Allah, towards the pleasure and the acceptance of Allah. Okay, so those are the two areas that I covered. Education is one, the workplace is another. The final area that I want to touch on is the issue of marriage. Okay, and really what the main danger of mixing is that it undermines marriage. Okay, it undermines marriage. And why does it do this? And I've come back to this point, let me come back to this point and reiterate it, what I mentioned before. Mixing benefits men and disadvantages women. And how does it do this? It does this by giving men easier access to women. It gives men easier access to women, and this disadvantages women in many ways. Let me explain how. First, women have to compete for the attention of men. Women have to make more and more compromises in order to be seen and be noticed by men. Okay? Because there's so much more competition if men have constant access to women within their workplace, within the educational environment, and within society at large. So standards of what it requires for men to be able to be with women continues to decrease. And we see this very clearly within history. Okay? Prior to this erosion of gender segregation and gender separation, for a man to be with a woman, a man had to make commitment. Okay? A man had to make commitment and had to promise to provide and had to show their worthiness, had to show his worthiness, that he is worthy of being a husband and being a partner. Okay? And now none of that applies. Because it is so easy for a man to access women in a way that violates modesty and violates the norms of proper interaction between the genders. Okay, so that's one main way that the disillusion of gender separation hurts women. Another way is that there's so much pressure to constantly be under the gaze and under the scrutiny of men. Okay, so this hurts women, and there's so much emotional baggage and so much emotional weight that are on the shoulders of women and young girls when they're constantly under the gaze of men. When you're all in the same environment, when you're mixing and interacting and flirting and talking and communicating in that very casual way, it causes a huge burden. It causes a huge weight. And that affects your education. It affects your ability to even want to get married. Why get married when you can have all this kind of interaction with no commitment, with no cost, with no dedication, with no promise, and so on and so forth. So this is another major burden especially on young girls and women. And the third area is that if you look at the statistics, within the West, over 50% of mothers are single mothers. Over 50% of mothers are single mothers, which means that they have to raise children by themselves. Okay? These are single parent households. And the statistics show that children that are born and raised in single parent households are more likely to fall into crime. They're more likely to fall into drugs. They're more likely to be unemployed. Okay? They're more likely to end up in prison. So these are all strains on society. These are all problems that are generated for society, men and women included. That is created because of single parenthood. And what is it that has led to this rise of single parenthood within the West? Well, obviously, it's very obvious. The standards of haya, the standards of interaction and not engaging in zina, these have all been eroded, okay? Because it's all related. All of these are connected. And so there's a great wisdom, okay, in why Allah has prevented these kinds of behaviors within Islam. This is something that we should be confident and show the rest of the world the wisdom of this. So what else can we say about the dangers of mixing when it comes to its effect on women? Well, I want to talk about the standards within Islam itself, okay, and why marriage is so important. Marriage is so important because family is the building block of society. Family is the central pillar on which the rest of society and civilization is based within Islam. And we know this from how often Allah tells us in the Quran to maintain ties of kinship, silat rahim, where Allah tells us to be good to our parents, to obey and be respectful to our parents. Allah tells us the importance of maintaining ties of kinship with our family. This emphasis is to say, the wisdom of this is that the family is so critical and so crucial to the flourishing of humanity in the world, okay, and in this dunya. And we need those connections, and that is all based on family, and that's all based on marriage, right? And so anything that undermines marriage undermines family, and therefore undermines society, undermines civilization, right? So we have to see these kinds of connections, and this kind of ikhtilat, this kind of mixing that has become so common in the world today, clearly, unequivocally undermines marriage and therefore undermines the family. Okay, so before I conclude, I also want to tell you something positive about gender separation and what it means in Islam. So, of course, we know that men and women shouldn't mix. They shouldn't casually interact. They shouldn't be joking and having these kind of casual relationships that are so conducive to zina and other kinds of problems in society, as I've discussed. But, when it comes to certain situations in the present world, there are situations where it's unavoidable, right, for men, strange, non-mahram men and women to interact. And so there are dispensations for that religiously, and I encourage you to study these details and learn about them. But even in cases where where it's unavoidable and you have to interact with the opposite sex, you should understand that Islam requires a code of conduct. Islam requires respectable behavior. So this is something to also study and keep in mind. And then the third point is that we have to remember the importance of chivalry in Islam, right? What it means to be a man in Islam. Muru'a and rujula, these are all concepts of chivalry that many of us have lost touch with in the modern world because we've bought into standards of gender that are so far away from Islam and so far away from the Sunnah. And so men have to want to avoid interacting and casually mixing with non-mahram women in the same way that they would not want other men interacting with their sisters or with their mothers or with their daughters or other female family members. So this is the sense of haya, this is the sense of qawama that men need to have, okay, ghayra, these concepts. If you don't know what they mean, I encourage you and deeply urge you to study these concepts and to understand the meaning of having a Muslim personality and having that kind of character, khuluq, that is so important in Islam, and what it really means to be a man, right? Because it's not enough to be a male. Okay, it's not enough to be a male. You have to be a man. And if we want to understand how men behave, we look to the greatest of all men, the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him. We look to his sunnah, we look to his example. We look at the Sahaba. We look at the mothers of the believers. We see how they interacted with the opposite sex, how they separated and maintained hayat practically in their lives. So these are the pillars, the exemplars that we have to be looking towards. Okay, so just to reiterate, the main problem with gender interaction and mixing is that it undermines marriage. It therefore undermines the family, which is so important and so critical to society. And we're seeing around the world erosion of all these important concepts, erosion of family all around us. It's leading to all kinds of societal ills. Like I mentioned at the beginning, this is a sickness that is spreading across the globe and infecting Muslim societies. So how do we counteract this sickness? What's the cure to this sickness? I want to be very practical with you and say that the cure is marriage, okay? And we have, unfortunately, this tendency, increasing tendency within the world to push back marriage and to delay marriage. And I want to discourage you from doing this. And from my own personal life, I was married immediately after I graduated college, graduated Harvard. My wife was also at Harvard. She was 1 year younger than me. So we got married when she was still in school, doing her senior year at Harvard. So we need to encourage early marriage. And as university students, you need to practically be thinking about this and talking to your parents about this, working with your parents so that you can get married. Because it's not fair when we insist on gender separation. It's not fair to then force children to not have the option or the access to get married until their late 20s or even their 30s. So this is a problem, and this is what has also become more and more common within the Western world, even Muslims within the Western world, in America, the UK, Germany, etc. And so this is something that we need to address. We need to revive the Sunnah of early marriage, and that's exactly what we see with the Sahaba, with the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The greatest generations, the Salaf, they practiced early marriage relatively to our time. And so we have to take that as a complete system, okay? Because Islam is a complete system. It's not just gender separation, okay? It has to be coupled with the importance of marriage and building those families that will be the building blocks of a healthy Islamic society and will create that next generation of strong Muslims that will revive the glory of Islam within the dunya and within the world today. Okay, so I pray that Allah forgives us for our sins and helps us to understand the wisdom of this deen of ours. And I pray that Allah gives us the tawfiq to follow and to comply with the sunnah. And inshallah, Allah will grant us tawfiq in this life and the next. Jazakum Allahu khairan. May Allah bless you. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.